absence and presence is such an interesting thing. That's pretty good, right? Not bad. Not bad. All right. Let's talk about chapters 42 through 53. And if possible, because you have turned in a major assignment today, and I do appreciate you being here, I will try and wrap it up quickly, as soon as possible. I will not feel compelled to go the entirety of the time, though. You know how it goes in this class. Remember what we talked about last time. We talked a little bit about the Cave of Montesinos and the fallout from that. We saw Don Quixote engage in the adventure of the water wheels and meet two truly noble individuals, or literary individuals, the Duke and the Duchess. The Duke and the Duchess, who have read the first part of Don Quixote, the ingenious knight Don Quixote, and like the character Don Quixote. And because they are so interested in the fact that they have met this fictional character out in the real world, they wish to bring him to their home, where they will themselves act as literary fictional authors. They will themselves, with the help of their steward, put on many hijinks and amusing pranks with Don Quixote as well as Sancho. Sancho will be sent to the walled fortress, the Insula Barataria, which is just a couple leagues away from this landlocked house. And he will not get on a ship to go to the insula. In fact, a very funny moment later in the text is that Sancho, for the first time, gets on a ship, which if Sancho were truly intelligent and not ignorant in very specific ways, though of course very clever, he would know that obviously he did not make his way to a small island, because that requires the passage of water, passing over water, which generally requires either a bridge or a ship of some sort. Then we saw the episode of the Dolores Dueñas put on, and this is one of the first phantasmagoric episodes put on by the Duke and the Duchess to deceive Don Quixote and Sancho. And there we meet Merlin, and hear that Dulcinea has in fact been enchanted. This is based on the fact that the Duchess and Sancho had sat down just before this, and Sancho had admitted that he had fibbed about Dulcinea being enchanted, but the Duchess, being clever herself, said, "No, you didn't fib. You are yourself deceived. She is enchanted." And what do we find out that Sancho must do, not Don Quixote, in order to disenchant Dulcinea? He must himself, in a fairly hard way, not with a hand, possibly with a cat of nine tails with iron tips, whip himself 3,300 times. And though Don Quixote does think at first that he might be able to help, and does later think that he might be able to help, he ultimately doesn't. Something funny about this is, I told you Sancho is clever. You know Sancho is clever. Is that Sancho will eventually get out of this by whipping trees and crying himself. He'll be like, "Oh, that was a terrible one." Hits a tree. "Oh, this was terrible." And eventually, actually, Don Quixote will pause him and say, "Sancho, please, please, I didn't want you to kill yourself so that I might be with Dulcinea." And he shows his good-heartedness towards Sancho, though Sancho is, of course, fibbing on him. This is one of those great moments in literature where a character who's either brilliant or mad shows that he has a heart. You may have heard of Sherlock Holmes, and in the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stories, I can't remember the particular one, though I could look this up very easily. Sherlock Holmes puts Watson in harm's way and thinks that Watson has been shot dead. And he runs to Watson and says, "Oh my God, I will never forgive myself for what I've done." And Sherlock Holmes is often seen as a cold, analytical, extremely competitive, intelligent individual, not as somebody who's warm and loving. But in that moment, he shows the breadth of his heart. In this moment, Don Quixote, I think, also shows the breadth of his heart. Though he will show his intelligence, his wisdom, and his heart through the advice that he gives to Sancho before Sancho takes on his governorship as well. All right, and so those are the things that are lying in the background when we get into chapters 42 to 53. Today, Sancho's governing the walled city, which is called the Insula Barataria, and Don Quixote's advice to him. We talked a little bit about how the names are becoming more and more abstract and simply etymologically indicative of what they mean, like clavileño, meaning peg, antonomasia, meaning to name something by substitution, like to call a ladies' man a Don Juan, as it were, or there are like sort of crude construction person ways of doing this too, like acts of metonymy, like if these, I can't even say these sorts of things. So when I was growing up, a crude way to address somebody and to be slapped was to be like, "Hello, sugar lips." That is an act of metonymy or antonomasia, and also a good way to I don't think people talk that way these days and expect good results, but that was something that people would say. Though usually on TV, I don't know if I ever heard somebody in real life say that sort of thing. All right, so the Duke and the Duchess, as I told you last time, they command their entire household to act as if Don Quixote is a chivalric knight and to be in on the game. And they will also be giving Sancho an insula. Something interesting about Sancho and his insula. We're going to talk about 3 of the puzzles that he is given at the beginning of his reign that the insulados, those are people who live in the insula, give to any new governor to see whether they should be happy or sad, depending on how he answers these questions. We're going to spend the vast majority of the time that we spend together today going through those because they're interesting and I would say funny, though one of them involves a moment which is a bit, could be a bit triggering, though it is done with a light touch, not with a brutal touch. That said, not every person in Sancho's walled city, which is called an insula, which it's not, though it is called one, but that's a major theme in this text, things being called what they are not, and that being problematized, is that some of the characters in the insula do not know that this is a game, that this is a farce, that this is being put on by the Duke and the Duchess. Many do, but not all. All right, so the Duke and Sancho wax philosophically. You know that waxing is the opposite of waning. When the moon is waxing, it's becoming larger in the sky, when it's waning, it's smaller. So waxing philosophic. It's like something people do late at night, you know, if you're on instant messenger with somebody or something. Do you wax philosophic with people? You wait till the night because that's when you truly get philosophical. Oh, that was my favorite thing when I used to be able to stay up like at y'all's age. I was like, man, well, the day's out, it's normal. Once night comes, that's when, you know, we can really burn up a keyboard and say the most interesting things. And it probably had something to do too with the fact that I could write things that I could not say to people in person. Still encounter that at all? Any of you? Do you ever like tell the most meaningful things to people through writing rather than through saying? It means more when you say it. But you can say things better when you write it. So there's give and take. In any case, they talk about the nature of power. The Duke tells Sancho the ability to command is sweet, and few like to give it up once they have tasted it. Something I want you to keep in mind is, does Sancho ever give up his commanding authority, his commanding tone after he completes his tenure as a governor? He doesn't stay very long as governor. He spends about a week being a governor. He spends basically the exact amount of time as Don Quixote spends laid up in the Duke and the Duchess's home in a sort of Sir Gawain-esque way, resting, though hijinks will occur, including what I think is one of the funniest moments in the text, which is when a bag of cats is dropped onto Don Quixote's head and one attacks his face. He doesn't have a helmet on at that point, so it does quite a bit of damage to someone we already know has a sorrowful face, though he is the Knight of the Lions. Now, his name will change yet again prior to the end of this text, too, when he becomes, or when he is transitioning in, or when he is planning to transition into the role of being not a pastor, but a character within a pastoral romance, a shepherd. There we are. The language of pastors has to do with sheep and goats, by the way. You're major sort of religious person. And separating the sheep and the goats is a nice New Testament book. Come to separate the sheep and the goats. So that's why pastors are called pastors. And you're like, oh, do they have a flock? Metaphorical flock. All right. Don Quixote then pulls Sancho aside to advise. And we get basically 2 chapters in a row of philosophical maxims that Don Quixote speaks to Sancho. And I'm just going to say a few of them out loud. And then I'm going to kind of look at you. And I want you to kind of nod a little, like you agree. If you agree, kind of shake your head if you're like, or just yawn in my face if you're not paying attention. Okay. Yeah. All right. I have a few of them emboldened. Let's see. First, he tells Sancho that he is a blockhead and he did not earn his government. I believe in our actual translation, it's you're an adult and you didn't earn this. So you should be grateful because this is a reward from heaven. You should be grateful for things that you do not deserve. Okay. I mean, just think about this. Think about this outside the scope of Don Quixote. Think of this as somebody who you respect giving you advice. You may not respect Cervantes or Don Quixote, and perhaps with good reason. Cervantes with his missing hand, Don Quixote with his insanity. but I mull these over. These are maxims for you to think about. Sancho should fear God, and he'll be steered right. It's a bit of a 17th century thing, but if you're religious, you probably get the force of that. Sancho should know himself. But this is the most important thing to do. I'll give this to you in Greek so that you can know it. Gnothi. Let me transliterate it. Gnothi, I know it sounds kind of weird. Let's say auton. Gnothi is the imperative of to know. Gignoskein. So it means know. And say auton is the reflexive third person pronoun, thyself. Or sorry, second person. No, it's a third person, but yeah, so know oneself is actually what it means. Know oneself, but we often put it in the second person. You've noticed that we often make universal statements of the second person rather than the third person. I say, you know how things are. You know how people are rather than one knows. One is actually the most appropriate way of saying this sort of thing. It is the most inclusive way, one, as long as you're not cracked, right? I was thinking about it. You know, there's a Cracked magazine. It's actually pretty fun. Still fun. I think it came around. It's an old magazine. And I even have one of its books, which is called something like the Untext Book. Unteaching you things that you think you know that you don't really. Okay, in any case, virtue is acquired and better than noble birth. Any of you come from a very prominent Louisiana family whose city is named for your family's name? Do any of you know people like that? Yeah, I know a couple too. I know one from the history graduate program. His family is the prominent family in Zachary, supposedly. Though I don't think his last name is Zach. A lot of the people down, like places like Monroe, come from like Civil War time figures, and prior to that, Louisiana Purchase, and which some of you probably know much better than I do. You should not turn away poor relations, even when you are a noble relation. If Teresa dies, he should not marry a woman who desires him for his money. Don't let subjective law rule in your mind and be compassionate to the poor. Let the facts rule the case. And if you've been harmed by the person that you're judging, put that injury to the side and judge them based on not your relationship to them, but their relationship to the law. That's a very difficult thing to do. I can tell you as somebody who manages people, not a ton of people, it is difficult to put one's personal emotions to the side and act objectively if somebody has acted in such a way as to arouse strong negative emotion. It's hard to really be kind to somebody or to judge somebody in the most generous spirit if you resent them because they've been cruel to you or annoyed you or constantly insolent to you. And so having the ability to put that to the side is extraordinary. A very rare, not gift or talent, but skill, because it takes skill. You don't get to the other side of the fire without going through the fire. So that would be my one piece of advice to you. Go through the fire and don't look for any shortcuts. All right, just a couple more of these. Don't be ruled by passion. Be merciful over being just. Remember that criminals are human. I think that's a tough one. Remember that criminals are human. Show mercy without injuring the innocent. I think that's also very important because there are times when mercy can harm somebody who has been harmed, right? You just let a vicious murderer go after having killed somebody's family, perhaps that injustice will do more harm than you sparing that person's life. In any case. Oh yes, and Barataria itself, just to loop back to a point I started earlier and didn't finish, has a very interesting etymology. It means a few things. It means to barter, which means to trade basically, but to haggle over prices and what the value of things are. But it also means to attain cheaply. You can see the connection between these ideas. If you're really good at bartering, you're going to get things cheaper than their value. But it's hard to barter. Are any of you really good at negotiating? Okay, I'll tell you one thing about negotiating. You can't negotiate unless you can walk away. If you can't walk away, there's no negotiation. You don't have any power. You just have to accept what the conditions are. So if you're like trying to negotiate with, like, say, a parent, sometimes with like a teacher, it can be sort of hard because there's very little that you can offer. But if you're in a flea market, there's $5. You might say, well, I only have $2. And that's liquid. that's liquid capital for them. So they may sell and may still not be a loss for them. They may take the loss just to get some more money. And so keep that in mind. People are selling to sell and you're buying to buy. All right. So just a couple more of these maxims before I move on. Don't be a glutton. Be careful that you don't chew and don't belch, but he uses the word eructate. An excellent Latinic word to use for expelling air, to eructate. It's such an ugly word, he says in Spanish, belch, that one should retreat to Latin to say eructate. I mean, there are other words like this, like to chew. A Latin word for that is to masticate, even to what do we say? Past water, micturate. You probably know about urinate, but micturate's even farther than that. So we have these Latinic sort of medical terms to obscure what we consider vulgar actions, as it were. And so that's one of them. And also, perhaps most importantly, Don Quixote tells Sancho they need to learn to read and write, because being left-handed, like my mother, was, or not knowing how to read and write, means that he came from a family that did not have enough money or the appropriate morals to educate him, or the appropriate values, I suppose I should say. He tells all of this to Sancho, and the reason that he tells Sancho that he needs to learn to read and write is Sancho says, "You said all these brilliant things to me, Don Quixote, but what will the value of them be?" This is perhaps what you have to say to me, "if I can't remember them at all." And Don Quixote says that we should have them written. And then he calls Sancho adult again. And then Sancho has a moment of self-knowledge, I suppose you might say. He says, "Well, Don Quixote, master, if you really think that I'm unworthy of this governorship, I would rather serve in heaven than be a governor in hell. I would give this up if you think that I'm not up to the challenge." And in this moment, he shows such character that Don Quixote says that he would be fit, Sancho, to be governor not just of one insula, but of two, because he has a good heart. And the most important thing to being a good leader is to have a good heart. I think that's certainly a very important part, perhaps not the most. But Don Quixote gives him sort of typical advice. If he follows God, he can't be steered wrong. All right. Chapter 44, Sancho departs to govern. Don Quixote is seduced by Altisidora. So the Duke and the Duchess jump into starting their hijinks and their play basically immediately after having separated Sancho and Don Quixote. And they soon will. So the steward who accompanies Sancho to his new village, his island, his insula, is the same one who played the Countess Trifaldi. And in fact, Sancho recognizes him. And recognizes him by his face and his voice. It says, "Oh, very much like the very beautiful Countess Trifaldi," and also has a very similar voice to the Countess Trifaldi. Don Quixote admits that there's resemblance, but obviously this man cannot be the Countess Trifaldi. I don't know why he couldn't be, given the nature of enchantment in Don Quixote, but he tells us this. Don Quixote then Sancho and the Grey are outfitted, befitting their status. They change into clothing that is appropriate to governing, which is, again, a major theme in this text. Changing clothing and changing identity. We remember this all the way back to Marcella and Grisostomo, where Grisostomo decided to be a shepherd, and Marcella decided to be a shepherd too, /shepherdess. And we've seen all manner of cross-dressing, changing of names, and in fact, even changing from factual professions to fictional professions. In the case of Sancho and Carrasco, becoming a chivalric knight, as well as Don Quixote. So, and we have in fact seen actors too in their garb, treated as if they were actors, not as if they were demons in training that needed to be defeated by Don Quixote. So it's sort of funny that he says you need to wear the appropriate clothing. We do know that he himself feels as if he needs to look like a chivalric knight from the fact that he had the helm of Mambrino, which was a barber's basin, and didn't quite fit right. But he insisted on having this helmet so that he looked like a knight, so that he looked the part, as it were. Okay, and perhaps that's all that he does effectively, though perhaps he acts the part too. So Sancho and Grey leave. They bid a tearful farewell. Don Quixote, we're told, actually finds himself missing Sancho, and would even considers that he would love to cancel Sancho's commission to have him back. Sancho, whom he had yelled at for talking too much, and in fact restricted his talking, then later took the restrictions off. The same Sancho who put barley and curds into his helmet and then let him put his helmet on and have curds shoot down his face. The same Sancho is now somebody that Don Quixote can't bear to be without. It's almost like over time, psychologists will talk about the mere exposure effect. It suggests that the things that you commonly see during the course of the day, you come to long to see. You come to appreciate, you come to enjoy their presence. So like say if you go to the gym every day and the same people are there every day and one of the people then on Wednesday is not there, you will notice their absence and miss them. Just by the fact that your usual circumstances change. Perhaps it's also the case in some of the classes that you're in. Some people are in them some days and they're better days. Some people are not in them in other days and they're worse days. All right. Well, now we find out that there's a character named Altisidora. And I told you that altissima in Latin means highest, it's a superlative, and dora, gift. I guess, yeah, donum also gift. But like highest gift is something like what her name means. And so Don Quixote goes to bed, he wakes up, he opens his window, and he hears two women talking. And one of these women is talking about how much she loves Don Quixote, and she starts to sing. He then talks to himself and says, oh, why is it that women, especially women of 14 to 15 years old, cannot help but love you? So you see something about the marital conventions and romantic conventions at this time. Men were often a little bit older. Women could be quite a bit younger, not 18, 21, like we might expect, but 14, 15 years old. That number comes up a couple times here. Apparently that is the age to be, but in an age when you could get second eye fairly young, you might have to get things started a little bit earlier, especially without formal education taking quite as much time. In any case, Don Quixote is now being pursued by Altisidora. Again, spatial form then occurs. This means that simultaneous events are occurring, but they're being represented linearly. What that means is, so chapter 44, one thing happens to chapter 45, something happens in a different place, but at the same time. So in the Insula or in the home of the Duke and the Duchess. This is a convention that I think if you're Game of Thrones fans, you've seen quite a bit on that HBO show. So Sancho, finally, without further ado, gets to his Insula. There are about 1,000 people there, and he's greeted in a warm, hearty way. He's the city-made governor, and as I just told you earlier, not everybody is in on the secret, so some people are quite surprised. He's placed on the throne, and the steward tells him, "It's the custom in this land for new governors to be put to the test. His answers will either assure his people of his wisdom or assure them of his lack of wisdom and make them regret that he has come." He also asks what is written on the wall because he cannot read, and he hears that the date of his assumption of the throne has been put on the wall, and he is himself. This is an interesting moment in terms of know thyself. He's called Don. Even though he's been made a governor, fictionally speaking, he refuses to go by Don. He says, "I've never been called Don. None of the people in my family have ever been called Dons. You must have so many Dons in this insula that you're just accustomed to calling people Dons. But I, Sancho, not Don." So that'd be a really interesting thing to think about. He allows himself to be made a governor, but he doesn't allow himself to be given a noble rank in terms of title. And here are the tests. There are 3 of them. Let's go through them, and perhaps I will do more than that today, but perhaps not. The first case that's put before Sancho, 2 elderly men come before him, and one says that he had lent to the other one 10 golden escudos. 10 gold escudos, quite a bit of money. And the other one claims that he had actually already returned the money. Now, something interesting about this is that the man who gave the creditor who gave the money to the debtor claims the debtor is a good Christian man, and therefore he will take him at his word if he swears in front of the Duke that he had returned the money to the creditor. And the creditor will just assume that he forgot. Who knows the conceit of this? Who really, did any of you follow what happens next very closely? Well, so the debtor, who supposedly still has the 10 golden escudos, goes to give his oath to Sancho. But while he does, he asks his friend to hold his staff, as if it were cumbersome. Oh, hey, hold my staff. Like, what is it? It said in means now, hold my beer or whatever, hold my drink, hold my staff. And while he gives then he gives his oath, and he says, I have returned the 10 gold escudos to this man and to my creditor. And the creditor says, huh, that's weird. What happened? The creditor is not lying. But what are you, okay, yeah.
Like the reference King Solomon, he broke the staff in 3 pieces, pointed inside the staff and stuff. And he gave the staff to his friend saying, well, I gave him the money, but it's inside the staff.
Clever, it reminds me of Jurassic Park in the raptor. Clever girl, right? Yes, the staff itself had the golden escudos in it. So when he handed the 10, not the 4 there, golden escudos, 5 there, golden escudos to his friend, technically he had returned the golden escudos to him, though obviously under fraudulent circumstances, and he was attempting to defraud and steal from him. But Sancho witnesses this transfer of the cane, breaks it open. And do you know what? So King Solomon is reputed for being the wisest man in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. Do you know the story that is linked to this? Why Sancho is called another Solomon? There's a very specific story about Solomon's wisdom. Yes?
It's the one about child being argued.
Okay, so 2 mothers. There were 2 mothers and 1 child, and they were arguing that this child was, one said, child is mine, the other said, the child is mine. What does King Solomon decide to do in order to decide the issue? Fairly, yes.
We cut the baby in half.
Yeah, cut the baby in half. And you might be like, which half do you get, the legs or the head? It's like, you can cut it vertically in half. But then what happens? So, okay, let's just cut the baby in half, Solomon says. Well, then the true mother says, no. The other mother, the false mother, can have the child. I would rather the child live than be dead. And through that conceit, Solomon decides, actually, the baby is yours. You have to care about the baby. And so there's another sort of similar sort of idea, I would say. In this case, the baby being threatening to split the baby in half is similar to actually splitting the staff into 3 and realizing what is inside it. All right, second case. This case, a little bit of a trigger warning here. So just to soften what is happening here, you should know that clearly what has happened is a somewhat wealthy man who claims to be poor while he's in front of a magistrate has negotiated an amount of money to give to a prostitute in order to sleep with her. The reason that he represents himself as poor is why? Because you don't want to pay her more. Right. You don't go into a negotiation looking baller, because you want your lawyer or your accountant or your financer to look baller. You want them to have extremely expensive suits on, but you yourself want to look perhaps modest when you go into any sort of negotiation, because you don't want people to take you for all of your work. You want to pay as little as possible, generally, if you're negotiating for your own self. And so that's what's happening. Now, this woman, however, claims that the man took her by force. This was not, in fact, a negotiated settlement that was consensually agreed to. And so she is demanding more from him. So let me read a little about this. The next case, a woman accuses a rich man of taking her by force. The man claims he went into town to sell 4 pigs, and he mentions for less than their worth, so that he's fair and just. When he returned, he just couldn't help it. He made love to this woman, but he paid her the appropriate amount afterwards. She cursed at him after receiving the amount that they had supposedly agreed on, and followed him all the way to the city and to the insula, I guess, technically, swimming across the grass. and into the throne room of the governor and wants to settle this issue. Sancho says, okay, do you have, how much do you have on you? And the man says, I have 20 ducats silver, fairly a good amount of money, not an impoverished amount of money. He says, okay, give that to the woman. She's super stoked, very happy. She just gotten exactly what she wants. But she's one would think that she would not just be super happy given what had just transpired, right? She might feel a sense of justice, but not ecstasy, as it were. She then curtsies and leaves. The man starts to cry. Why is this an interesting moment? What does that tell you if you're the judge? If the man who's just given the money starts to cry, what does that suggest? All he had, yeah, maybe he's destitute. Now, it might also suggest this this raw emotional reaction of the moment that an injustice has been occurred. He doesn't look shamefaced. He cries as if something incorrect. So I'll tell you one interesting thing. Supposedly, back when there was East Germany and West Germany, and there was a police force called the Stasi in East Germany, and part of what they did was they kept a check on their own individuals. Remember, East Germany was communist and was under the Soviet sort of iron curtain, and through East Berlin, right in Germany, that mattered. Because Germany was the most powerful European country when it was divided. It is again the most powerful European country undivided. But something that, and this comes from the movie The Lives of Others, but I think it is probably true, and I could look into this. When they would take innocent people and keep them up all night, or nights and nights in a row and interrogate them, supposedly innocent people would become more and more enraged at the situation, upset, and curse these people. Whereas people who were not innocent, were guilty, they would start to repeat the same words and parts of stories that they had told over and over. What does this suggest? Well, people who are innocent feel the injustice of a situation. It comes out, whereas people who are guilty have memorized the story. So they're not telling you what they remember, telling you what it is that they've memorized. And when you talk about something that you've memorized, you repeat the same phrases, the same words. All this I go to say is that injustice seems to arouse emotion in people. In any case, Sancho then says, okay, this guy's crying, this woman left out, run after her and go get your silver back. He runs after her, comes back into the throne with her still fighting alongside him. She's apparently so strong. And Sancho says, what is this man doing? And she says, this weakling couldn't get any of this money away from me. Sancho says, give the money back to the man. He says, if you had fought this hard for your virtue, as you do for your money, then you would have been fine. The idea being that Sancho seems to believe that this was in fact a prostitute who was in fact paid the negotiated amount, who is now attempting to unfairly get more money out of this wealthy man that was agreed upon, based on the fact that she is strong enough to keep him from taking her money. Ostensibly, she would also be strong enough to keep this weak merchant from taking how's it also described as the gift that cannot be returned after taken, or however it is that Don Quixote often puts it. All right, and then she's also exiled under threat of lashes. Last test. Last people that come before Sancho, this is another kind of like gift of the Magi sort of genie idea. What do I mean when I say that? Sometimes when you watch older versions of Aladdin or any sort of movie that has a genie or a dream master or a wish master of some sort, when one wishes for something, or like a monkey paw, like the Simpsons Halloween of Horror, when one wishes for something and gets what one wishes for, there are often unintended consequences. And so in this situation, this man brings a certain amount of cloth to a tailor and says that, and it's about the amount of cloth necessary to make one hat, one human-sized hat. But he says, I don't want one hat, I want 2, I want 3, I want 4, I want 5. The tailor's like, with this amount of cloth? Okay, I can make 5 hats. And so he does make 5 hats, or caps for this individual. But when they're shown to Sancho, there are 5 caps that are big enough to fit on one's fingers. And so he did make 5 caps with the cloth provided for him for this individual, but has he done as he was asked? This is, I think all of these cases are very good ways of seeing differing versions of fraud and defrauding somebody. And something you should know is that fraud is a huge, huge, huge civil penalty in the American legal system. And in fact, if you watch Anna Delvey, who's now on Dancing with Stars, this is what she's famous for. It's defrauding individuals. In fact, she has an ankle monitor, and she's still under house arrest in Manhattan because of it. And if you read Dante, who I happen to be a scholar of, he has 9 circles in his hell. The 8th circle has 10 versions of fraud in it. 8th circle of hell, right before traitors. And so defrauding people is what's funny, because it can sort of seem like it's not doing anything at all, right? You technically agreed with somebody, you gave them what you claimed to, but there's deception involved. And that deception is what makes this little thing, don't even have any space, so it seems like a little thing, far bigger thing. Yeah, I think to some extent, this is why, you know, in a relationship, whether it be with your parents or your significant other, when you lie, that's a big deal, right? You lied about something small. You just didn't want to be scolded like Sancho. And yet the moment that you lie, one becomes aware, and lying is a form of fraud. One becomes aware that you might be capable of lying. The moment one realizes you're capable of lying, what does this throw in? What does this do to one's perception of you and one's entire history with you? It opens it up to question. When else did you lie? Start to think through patterns. That's also what happens when you're a criminal, by the way. The first time you commit a crime, second time, third time, you might get away with it. But once somebody sees one thing you did, they're going to be tempted to find the pattern. And I'll tell you one thing, because you're young people. You don't get caught. You're lucky if you get caught the first time you do something. But often you don't. And it can create a pattern, but that pattern can be found. And once it's found, people see you for who you've been. That is a place that you don't necessarily want to go. In any case, so the tailor presents the 5 caps on the ends of his fingers. Sancho decides the tailor should not be paid for this effort, but that the man who provided the cloth should not receive these caps back anyway, and so they're going to be sent to prisoners in the jail. I don't know what use they would be to prisoners in the jail, but they're not going to be of any use to these 2 defrauding individuals. The people are then astonished at Sancho's wisdom. They're happy to have him, and they send a report back to the Duke. Okay, I'll conclude with this. In chapter 46, Don Quixote exits his chamber the next morning, and Altisidora, when she sees him as he walks by, and remember, this is Don Quixote. He's old, he's missing teeth, he's missing part of his ear. He's just not looking super great these days. And this beautiful Altisidora sees him. She swoons, she faints. And the lady in waiting next to her says, "Oh, cool, Don Quixote, keep walking, because it's your cruelty towards her that keeps her from, that is harming her right now." Well, so Don Quixote then requests a lute, which is a small stringed instrument, very popular in the Middle Ages, and decides that he is going to serenade her that night. He goes under her window to sing. Now, of course, this Altisidora, that's not the actual name of this maid. This is all just a prank that is being played on Don Quixote in order to play further, funnier pranks on Don Quixote. And some of these pranks actually get sort of physically harmful and go beyond what the Duke and the Duchess intended, particularly this one. And this is something perhaps to keep in mind if you are a prankster, that they can go farther than one expects. I don't know, have you ever seen the movie Gumball? It's about a sorority and recruitment, by the way. This woman is, I've never seen I just know the conceit of it, but basically a sorority sister is kidnapped by one of her sorority sisters. They put a giant gumball in her mouth and tape her mouth closed so she can't scream when she's put into their trunk. And when they take her out of the trunk, what can you guess has happened? She choked to death. And they're in terrible, terrible circumstances. Right, exactly. Not like old school where, they're abducting their fraternity individuals and it's all very funny. This was supposed to be fun, but it didn't quite work out. So something to keep in mind about bringing fiction to reality is there can be real consequences. So Don Quixote is singing with his lute underneath this window that he thinks is Altisidora's, and then a sack of cats. Think about a sack of cats. We're not trying to get cats into a sack. I don't know, any of you have cats and never try and get them into a carrier? Not super easy. They do not want to go into that carrier. And so the cats are jump on Don Quixote. He looks for a weapon to defend himself. He gets rid of all of them except for one. One that jumps like a face hugger from Aliens. I don't know if any of you are watching the most recent Aliens, like Alien Covenant. Jumps on his face and is tearing at him, and he has to eventually throw it off and out the window. He is himself still, he is not outside of the castle. He is in the lower turret. So he is himself in a chamber beneath the chamber. At least from what I can do with geography of it. The Duke then comes to his rescue. Don Quixote is angry that they interfered with his noble combat with the cat. Altisidora is then tending to his wounds and gets a few comments into him and says that pain was because of your disdain for me, noble knights. And I hope that Dulcinea stays enchanted forever with you. And Don Quixote doesn't reply, but thanks his co-host for coming to his aid, and the Duke and the Duchess, as I mentioned earlier, regret the fact that he came to injury because of their joke. All right, next time we're going to talk a little bit, well, not as much about Don Racio, the doctor of Sancho, I almost made the same mistake, who never lets him eat, Doña Rodriguez and her poor daughter, who now a farm boy refuses to marry. And we're going to get into the conclusion of this text and see how it is modernist, metempsychotic, and a masterpiece. And again, congratulations to you.